This is note taker 33 on Earth cycles. In this note taker, we're going to be looking at 3 of our Earth cycles. The first is the water cycle, the second is the carbon cycle, and the third is the nitrogen cycle. So far on our previous note takers, we're talking about interactions. So here on this note taker, we're talking about how our living and our non-living things like water, nitrogen, carbon all interact with each other in the ecosystem. The water cycle, which we're going to begin with, should be mostly a review for you. The carbon and nitrogen cycles are brand new, so please do your best to look carefully and study these diagrams so you know where living things get nitrogen and how nitrogen and carbon are given to things. So starting off with the water cycle, we have 4 parts to our water cycle. And because it is a cycle, that means a circle, it does not matter where you begin. I'm going to start with evaporation. Evaporation occurs when the sun heats up the water that can be found in your oceans, lakes, ponds, rivers, streams, and it's going to heat it up and turn the water, the liquid water, into gaseous water. So it's going to turn into a vapor. And since that vapor is lighter, it's going to rise up into the air. Water can also enter the water cycle through the process of transpiration. Not all water has to evaporate from a water source. Some water can actually evaporate out of our plants and out of the soil. So that would be transpiration. But regardless of where it comes from, water heated up is going to turn into a vapor and it is going to rise. Once it gets higher up into the air gets much cooler, so the cool temperature is going to cause the water to condense. Following evaporation would be condensation. Condensation occurs when water vapor gets cooled down, so it goes from a gaseous form back to a liquid form, and it's going to form tiny little droplets that are still really light, so we're going to be suspended in the air. And we call these clouds. Now, as water keeps evaporating, these water droplets get bigger and bigger and eventually get too heavy to stay suspended up in the sky. That's when we get precipitation. Precipitation occurs when so much water has condensed that it is too heavy for the air to hold. So the water has to fall back to Earth. And water is going to fall back in one of 3 different forms. It's going to fall back as rain, snow, or hail. We're going to talk about these 3 more in class and why they're so different from each other. Following precipitation, we have collection. Once the water hits back at the earth, whether it is snow, rain, or hail, once it collects back to the earth, that is collection. And it could fall directly back into a water source like rain over a river, or it can actually fall onto the ground. If it falls onto the ground and it soaks in, it becomes groundwater. Plants and animals will then use this groundwater either as it runs over the soil, or some of the plants will depend on the water that has collected underneath the ground. Also, some humans also depend on this water because your groundwater is what feeds a well. So if you live in a house that is attached to a well and that's where you get your water, like I do, then groundwater is actually very important to you. This diagram here, which you'll see again in class and we'll talk about it more, but this diagram represents how water cycles. A shows evaporation, where it is heating up. You see a little sun up there, smiley, happily heating up the water. As the water rises into the air, it's going to condense into a cloud. So B is condensation. When it gets really heavy, it's going to start to fall back to Earth. C would be precipitation. And then when it lands back on Earth, D would be collection. Now that cycle may seem very simple, however we haven't really talked a whole lot about how life forms interact in this cycle, because water is one of our non-living resources, but living things like plants and animals have to interact with it because you must have water to live. So in photosynthesis, water is going to be absorbed by the plants through the roots and is used to make food. Not all the water used will then evaporate back into the air through the openings in the leaf through the process of transpiration. Actually, if we take 1 6-month growing season, if we have one fully leafed tree, in one growing season, you're going to get about 7,000 liters of water evaporating out of that one tree. Now, to put that in perspective for you, if you've ever been to the grocery store and buy the big containers of soda, that's a 2-liter bottle. So you're looking at about 3,500 of those bottles full of water from one tree in one growing season. Now, that would be plants. Animals also take in water and give off water. We drink it, we do need it, but we also give it off during respiration and excretion. Respiration, when you take a breath out, a lot of the breath that you breathe out is water vapor. If you've ever stood in front of a mirror or a window, a cold mirror, cold window, and blow your breath on it, you'll notice that the mirror fogs up. You're making like a little mini cloud with your condensation. So through respiration and excretion, we are going to give water back off, and it's going to return it to the earth as a waste product. And our water cycle actually works as a wonderful filtration system. It's just the water that evaporates, none of the stuff that's in it. So our water cycle, when you evaporate water, acts as our own nature's filter for water. And actually, you may not know this, but all of you who have taken a drink of water from the fountain today, or from the sink, or from the water bottle, yes, that is the same water that dinosaurs peed in so long ago. In the carbon cycle, the first 2 parts I'm going to talk about is how animals and plants trade off carbon and oxygen. During photosynthesis, plants take in carbon dioxide, CO2. That C is the element of carbon. So plants are going to take that in, along with water and energy from the sun, and then they're going to convert all that into carbohydrates, which again, the C in carbohydrates, if you look at the C6H12O6, that is carbon. It's also going to make oxygen, which plants give off, and water. Then, during respiration, animals breathe in the oxygen, but we also eat those carbohydrates. So plants are giving us carbon through our food, and then we give plants carbon by breathing out CO2, which they take in for photosynthesis. But we're not the only part of the carbon system. It's much larger when we look at the entire ecosystem. This diagram here shows how everything in our environment is going to pass carbon dioxide along, or carbon, sorry, not carbon dioxide, but pass carbon along as well as receive carbon. So first of all, we have our fossil fuels like coal and oil in the ground. We dig those up, they are full of carbon. And when we use those in manufacturing, if you look at that manufacturing, that little factory, you see coming out of the smokestack, you see nasty smoke. That smoke has a lot of the carbon in it. So we're going to get the carbon into the atmosphere or air through burning of fossil fuels. Another way that carbon can get into the air, if you look at the little mouse in the picture, when we breathe out, we're giving carbon to the atmosphere. The final way that your air is going to get carbon is going to be through the bacteria in the soil. The bacteria is going to use oxygen and release carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide is going to go into the atmosphere. Now, for plants plants are going to take in that carbon dioxide from the air, and the plants are going to give carbon to two places. They're going to give carbon to animals when we eat them, and when plants die, they're going to give carbon to the soil, because carbon are one of the nutrients that your decomposers break down and return back to the soil. You'll also notice that there is an arrow pointing from the mouse to the ground. When animals die, again, decomposers break them down and return the carbon nutrients back to the soil so that more plants can grow. Nitrogen is another nutrient that we must need. All living things need nitrogen to build protein and other body chemicals. Now, animals can get nitrogen by one of two ways. We can breathe in the air, which is 78% nitrogen, or we can get nitrogen from eating plants. The soil is going to get nitrogen when plants and animals die, when animals excrete or poop, when we add fertilizer to our yards, that's very high in nitrogen, and when it rains outside or we have some stormy weather, some of the nitrogen from the air is going to kind of fix that nitrogen to the ground. Plants are going to get nitrogen from bacteria that is in the soil. This is called nitrogen fixation. It's the process by which bacteria takes nitrogen from the soil and turns it into a type of nitrogen that plants can use. Then we talk about the atmosphere or air. The atmosphere gets nitrogen from the soil through a process called denitrification. Just as bacteria help change it so that plants can use it, there are other bacteria that change nitrogen in the soil back into a gas form so that it leaves the soil and goes back up into the atmosphere. What I've just described on the previous slide is shown here in the picture. I know it looks very busy with all the arrows, but you do have to know how each of these things, air, soil, plant, and animal, you have to know how each gets nitrogen and how each gets carbon. And you also have to know where they give the nitrogen and the carbon to. Now this is a land ecosystem. Does the nitrogen cycle still hold true if we talk about a water ecosystem? Yes, it works the same way, except for instead of animals breathing in gaseous nitrogen from the air, the fish are taking in nitrogen from plants and also dissolved nitrogen that's in the water. But you see here that all the same ways we have atmosphere giving it to the soil through the weather. It ends up in the water and then that ends up in the ground. We have fertilizer runoff into the water. We have denitrification in the soil that gives nitrogen back to the air. And we also have nitrogen fixation, bacteria in the soil that gives it to the plants. And then animals and plants can give it back to the soil either by dying or animals' waste, which you see the fish pooping in the picture. Please don't forget to answer the 3 questions following the video.